I'll start with a guiding question of something for you to sort of keep in the back of your mind as I'm going through these topics, and look at the context of 19th century reform movements. So not just abolition of women's rights, but the broader context for this whole profusion of reform that came about, and then take a look at both abolition and women's rights. The guiding question I have is, in what ways are the abolition and women's rights movements connected? So context or contextualization is an important historical thinking skill. It's a way of thinking about the bigger picture, because you could look at abolition and women's rights in isolation and look at just at the people or their methods or their beliefs and ideology. But I thought it would be good to step back and look at the bigger picture and think about these huge changes that were taking place both before and during these reform movements. So one is the American Revolution, and this had intended and unintended consequences. Clearly, the war broke off the colonial relationship with Great Britain, but the Republican ideology developed during the Revolutionary period had implications far beyond what the Founding Fathers intended. Their articulation of natural rights, equality, and liberty inspired many groups of people at the time, and even today. We are still today grappling with the immensely radical promise of the revolution and still deciding whether we will recognize the equality of all groups of people. In the aftermath of the revolution, in the decades we're looking at, the language of rights clearly inspired abolition, women's rights, and a number of other reform movements. Another major context for understanding reform is the Second Great Awakening. Now, we could quibble about when the first camp meeting was held and what backwater part of the frontier, but we're in agreement as historians that there's a massive upswelling and sort of peaking in the 1820s and 30s as a religious revival swept the country. It had many components, but some commonalities was that it was an evangelical Christian movement that promised a few things that you can see on the screen here. And one was individual salvation. And this was partly an outgrowth of the elevation of the individual in the American Revolution. This new religious theology that was sweeping around the Atlantic world with the Second Great Awakening gave the power of salvation to each person rather than leaving it up to gatekeepers of the church hierarchy or predestination in the hands of only God. There's also a lot of very active conversion. And this also could be seen as a democratic impulse stemming from the American Revolution. It's the idea that religious teachings were not just restricted to ministers with theology degrees from Harvard or Yale or any of the original Ivies, that anyone could interpret the Bible, pray with their neighbor, or even jump on a mule and become a circuit riding preacher. There was also a lot of people who believed it was extremely powerful to share your story, often of sin and redemption, share your spiritual journey. Sometimes in front of a crowd, but sometimes just in one-on-one conversations. There's an emphasis on emotion, on feeling the divine, rather than learned translations from Hebrew or Greek. Sharing your spiritual journey and the ecstasy you found in salvation with your fellow humans was seen as a powerful way to bring others to the correct path. This meant that thousands of people, including women, were increasingly important in this new religious practice. Now, some of you today may think we might have gone too far down the path of the road of discarding expert knowledge in favor of personal feelings, but in the Second Great Awakening, in this time period in the 19th century, this trend felt very liberating to many, of getting away from a more sort of stuffy and orderly grasping of power by church hierarchy and an explosion of new feeling. And this actually made America an intensely religious country at a time where religion was often losing its power in England and Europe. Another trend in the Second Great Awakening was a belief in millennialism. In contrast to the Puritan worldview, which held that most people were full of sin, in the words of Jonathan Edwards, like a toad was full of poison, and the idea that most people were probably going to end up going to hell. In the Second Great Awakening, many people believed in perfectionism, the idea that everyone could be saved and we could actually make a perfect society. We could eradicate sin. And people believed that if we could do that, if we as a society could get rid of sin, they could trigger the second coming of Christ. And this sometimes intersected with nationalism, going back to John Winthrop's idea of this, that America was the city on a hill, that they thought that if we could do this best in America, Christ would come to America first when he came back to earth. And this millennial belief sometimes manifested literally, like Miller's followers who sold their possessions and stood waiting for this to happen. But it was also very widespread generally, empowered great energy for reform. People worked feverishly to identify and eradicate sin to prepare the way. If you are familiar with the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, this is part of the power of the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's the idea that perhaps Jesus would return to earth, but as an enslaved man. And what happens? We kill him all over again. Oh, spoiler alert there, sorry. So this message resonated with the reading public who believed this was literally possible, that we could, that if we didn't eradicate the sin of slavery, we would make the same mistake all over again. And so it's so vitally important for us to eradicate sins like slavery. One more large context of the reform movements of the antebellum period is the market revolution. This is a lot of things happening at once. And in some cases, it's an acceleration of trends already in place, like trading and investments. I have a colleague in European history who said he was once at a panel where people argued about the origins of capital investment, and they got back to a Dutch 12th century windmill that some people pooled their money on. So, pooling your money to make something is not entirely new, but I think the scale and the pace of it is new in this time period. So again, some of it is an acceleration of things that people had already done, and some of it's innovations and new technologies like canals, railroads, the steamboats you see here in the New York Harbor, famously the Erie Canal connecting New York City with the Midwest. There's also this scale of capital investments like pools of Boston merchants developing the Lowell mills. There's also the new idea about how to make things on the principle of interchangeable parts. If you've ever had uncomfortable shoes, you can blame the market revolution. This is where we moved away from cobblers lovingly making a shoe from start to finish to perfectly fit your individual foot, to the idea of interchangeable parts where artisans took a stack of leather and cut it out according to a pattern and made sizes that were standardized. So in the market revolution, there's more trade, there's mass-produced items competing with artisanal products, there's factories, there's new towns springing up along the canals and railroad lines. There's a shift of the entire region of the Northwest to less farming and more manufacturing production, and a new development of cities in the Midwest becoming increasingly the breadbasket of the Northeast. Okay, so what does all this have to do with reform? On the one side, there's a lot of optimism. Some people are becoming incredibly wealthy. The idea of society and new products and new technologies is meshing with the Second Great Awakening promise of perfectionism. It does look like society is getting amazing and better. There's the rising importance of individuals as people can, are really far away from the inherited land, aristocratic feudal traditions of Europe. And this looks like a far more democratic way of individuals who are smart and plucky and in the right place can make a lot of wealth. The rising importance of individuals in some ways. On the other side of the market revolution, there's a lot of pessimism that the world is changing extremely rapidly and becoming in some ways unrecognizable. There's clearly a growing wealth gap between the owners and the workers. Even neighborhoods were clearly becoming divided between wealthy areas and poor areas, with a lot of people having very uncertain and unstable livelihoods. So this impacted reform because some reformers were both excited by all these changes and possibilities unleashed by the market revolution, but they also saw growing problems in society. And so many people worked to address the problems created by the market revolution. In a little bit of a way you could think about the Gilded Age and then the Progressive Era, right? That's another time period of massive capitalist development and growing wealth and excitement, but also growing gap between the wealthy and the poor, and then reformers like Jane Addams and others stepping into the breach. All right, I put this chart together, which might be a helpful way for you and perhaps even your students to think about how all these big things are connected. And the American Revolution is a dividing line in all of these realms. So if we think about the realms of economics, politics, and religion, before the American Revolution, and I'm speaking in very broad terms here, I'm sure Deborah could find many flaws in what I'm saying. But before the American Revolution, in very broad terms, economics is dominated by mercantilism, with the idea that the center gets rich, the metropole um, benefits at the expense of the colonies, who send in raw goods that are then, taxed and manufactured in the metropole. So London gets rich at the expense of the colonies. In terms of politics, it's a world dominated by monarchies, which are, an inherited political power. And in religion, you've got some different strands in America, but the Puritans and Anglicans and Catholics, they're all a fairly hierarchical religion where salvation is determined either by God or by rituals through the church or the church elders. And after the American Revolution, in very broad terms, you have this increasing shift to the market revolution and capitalism, an increasing shift to democracy, an increasing shift to evangelical Christianity. So overall, it's a world in all these realms, not just politics, turning away from hierarchies and embracing the power of the individuals. So there's the idea that instead of just inheriting political power or wealth, anyone could get rich, anyone could be president. Well, white men only, but still, a broader realm, and anyone could go to heaven. So this is the world of the reformers, with all these massive changes going on in society, the rising importance of the individual, and the sense that they can go out and save the rest of the world. So the abolition movement occurs in this kind of rich stew of things happening. I have an image here of a woman named Mom Bet, who later renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman. And she's one of many African Americans who really led the way of seeing part of the radical potential of the Republican ideology of the American Revolution. Many of them went to court and argued that they should not be enslaved because the Declaration of Independence promised rights and freedom. And many of the Massachusetts courts agreed. And increasingly, this helped pave the way for Northern emancipation, as many Northerners agreed that slavery, and particularly the African slave trade, had no place in a democracy committed to rights and liberties. But as you know, many Southerners dug in and expanded their defense of slavery. And once the cotton gin was invented, slavery itself expanded westward. So you get this growing abolition movement that's committed to stopping the westward expansion of slavery and also hopefully freeing the slaves in the original colonies that became states. So we've got also the Quaker Church, who's the first church to, as a whole institution, say that slavery is wrong. This is in part because of their theology and believing that everyone has a spark of the divine inside of them. If you've ever heard the old hymn, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine," that's a Quaker idea that you've got a spark of the divine within you. And thus the Quakers concluded slavery was wrong because no one should be able to override the individuals listening to their own conscience, to their own spark of the divine. You should not have a master who can override what you think is the right thing to do. You also get the rise of individuals committed to abolition that you may know, like William Lloyd Garrison, and then the Grimkey sisters, Sarah and Angelina, who I'm going to talk about for a little bit. The Grimkey sisters grew up in South Carolina in a slaveholding family. First, Sarah and then Angelina converted to Quakerism and moved north. They became well known for their powerful stories of first-hand accounts of the cruelties and sins of slavery. And much like the Second Great Awakening that I talked about, this telling your personal story and bringing people on an emotional journey to move away from sin and towards the right way of living and thinking towards a more ethical society. That was incredibly powerful and popular. And increasingly, the crowds drew a lot of crowds, and they went on a speaking tour in 1836 that went over into 1837. And increasingly, they drew crowds that included men and women, which at that time period, there's a lot of shocking things about that. First of all, women speaking in public was considered very shocking, even in radical crowds like abolitionists. And speaking to a mixed crowd of men and women was also considered extremely improper. The term they used at the time was promiscuous. So if you ever heard the term promiscuous in the antebellum period, this is not like hookup culture or something like that. This is about men and women being in the same room, be it a schoolroom or a theater or a lecture hall. So the Grimkey sisters got a lot of backlash, and I'm going to go over a moment in 1837 where a lot of people pile on the Grimkeys and criticize what they're doing, and then the Grimkeys defend themselves. So one of the first people to criticize the Grimkeys was a woman, Catherine Beecher. If the name sounds familiar, she's part of the powerful Beecher family. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a prominent minister, and her sister, Harriet Beecher, married Calvin Stowe, and she became Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, both the Beecher sisters believed women should be powerful in society, but through a very limited and conservative channel. And here you can see what Catherine Beecher wrote about the Grimkey sisters. Woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself too much respected, esteemed, and loved, that to yield to her opinions and gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. But this is all to be accomplished in the domestic and social circle. All the sacred protection of religion, all the generous promptings of chivalry, all the poetry of romantic gallantry depend upon woman's retaining her place as dependent and defenseless. So if you ever teach about separate spheres in the antebellum period and the idea that men and women occupied separate spheres, this is a great passage to use to illustrate women's sphere. And this is a prominent woman in society saying women should stay to the domestic and social circles. Basically, you can influence your family and friends privately, but don't make a spectacle of yourself in public. A number of Congregationalists, so the inheritors of the Puritans, Congregationalist ministers in Massachusetts got together, and they were so shocked by the Grimkey sisters speaking in public that they wrote a letter and collectively signed it in 1837. I have here an image of Lyman Beecher, and I'm actually not sure if he signed it, but I wouldn't put it past him. And he's a good visual representation of a Congregationalist minister. So you can see in this excerpt, they had a number of points to make, and that they thought that the Grimkey sisters speaking in public were dangers that seemed to threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury. They were also clearly in the separate spheres mode, saying the power of woman is in her dependence, flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection. But when she assumes the place and tone of man as a public reformer, our care and protection of her seems unnecessary. We put ourselves in self-defense against her. She yields the power which God has given her for protection, and her character becomes unnatural. Then they have this great visual imagery. If the vine, whose strength and beauty is to lean upon the trellis work and half conceal its clusters, thinks to assume the independence and the overshading nature of the elm, it will not only cease to bear fruit, but will fall in shame and dishonor into the dust. Wow. So that is pretty rough, right? That men are like this strong elm tree and women should only be a dependent, clinging vine, sort of hiding its flowers. And if they try to change their nature, they're basically going to fall in the dirt as barren spinsters. If you ever incorporate art into your classes, this might be a fun passage to give students and have them create visual representations of this metaphor of men as elms and women as vines, and then maybe even to wonder what would be an appropriate present day metaphor, natural or otherwise. Another congregational minister named Amos Phelps, who was in the anti-slavery movement, so moving in some of the radical circles that the Grimkeys moved in, agreed with this criticism of the Grimkey sisters. And he wrote to them and asked them to quit speaking before promiscuous audiences. And you can see part of the response that they wrote back. Before I read it, I'll just say something about letters at the time. Letters, you might think of letters as private, and in many cases they were, but people also shared their letters, sometimes copying them or passing them around or things like that. So often people use letters like the equivalent of posting on Instagram or on Facebook or maybe even TikTok, like that a letter was sometimes sort of broadly shared. So the Grimkey sisters write back to Amos Phelps and say, the clergy have done an infinite injury to woman. Here they're talking about that pastoral letter. To close the doors now against our brethren would be a violation of our fundamental principle that man and woman are created equal and have the same duties and same responsibilities as moral beings. We should regret that a brother to whom we esteem so highly should identify himself with the men who set forth the pastoral letter, a letter which aims to tear from the woman her dearest rights and substitute the paltry privilege of leaning upon the fallen creature, that's man, instead of the strong arm of Almighty God. So here you can see their sense of betrayal from a fellow activist. And they're also saying, you guys don't have a monopoly on religion. We know our Bible, we can figure this out. And we're the ones following God's law, and we don't need men as an intermediary for us to know what's right. If you also note this term moral beings, that they're starting to move away from talking about men and women in physical terms and thinking about the, biological differences between them and putting men and women on the same plane as moral beings. So this is an early articulation of ways to think about men and women as equal. Another ally in the anti-slavery movement, Theodore Weld, makes the case that he totally supports women's rights. I'm with you, ladies, just not now. So in this first part, he tells them there's no reason why women should not make laws, administer justice, sit in the chair of state, plead at the bar, or in the pulpit, if she has the qualifications just as much as though she belongs to the other sex. So that's actually an extremely radical and fringe opinion for Theodore Weld to say women could be lawyers or heads of state or even a preacher. But then he goes on to say, let's prioritize here. Let us all first wake up the nation to lift millions of slaves of both sexes from the dust and turn them into men, and then it will be an easy matter to take millions of females from their knees and set them on their feet. So you can see his metaphors here that slaves are in the dust, women are only on their knees, so our top priority should be slavery. Another spoiler alert, they're fighting right now, but later on, Theodore Weld and Angelina Grimkey get married. So they patched up their differences later. But in 1837, they're still fighting. Even the poet, John Greenlee Whittier, who is a Quaker and an abolitionist, also took the same tack as Weld and suggested that women's rights were a diversion from the more important work of anti-slavery. Does it not look, dear sisters, like abandoning in some degree the cause of the poor and miserable slave? Later on in his letter, he called what women faced a trifling oppression. So clearly, all of these men are trying to get Sarah and Angelina to stop speaking in public, to take the pastoral letter to heart, and go back to helping the cause of abolition, just not by speaking in public to mixed audiences of men and women. But Angelina Grimkey had a powerful rebuttal, and she wrote a letter that was to both Weld and Whittier. She just lumped them together and circulated it and said that time to assert a right is the time when that right is denied. So she's telling them, we're not going to put this on hold. We're not going to put this on ice, that, you don't wait around for things like this. If someone attacks us now, we're going to respond now. She also says, and can you not see that women could and would do 100 times more for the slave if she were not fettered? So I focused so much on this back and forth in August of 1837 with Lyman Beecher and the pastoral letter and Amos Phelps and Weld and poets and the Grimkeys coming back, because this really creates it kind of forces the Grimkeys to think about what they're doing and say, should we continue this or should we not? And if we're not going to continue this, how do we defend ourselves? How do we say this is appropriate? And they're starting to articulate an idea of women's equality and an idea of women's rights. And so this kind of sets the stage for other people thinking about rights. And it in some ways, it splits the abolitionist movement, that some people side with the pastoral letter and say, no, this is just too much. Abolition itself is controversial. Like, people line up to punch out abolitionists when they go speak. When Frederick Douglass ran away from Maryland, he was born enslaved and then ran away to freedom, and he became a lecturer. He initially was taken with the idea of nonviolence and Quakers and whatnot. And when he went on the lecture circuit, people lined up to yell at him and sometimes punch him. And then he started punching back. And so he left nonviolence, in part because abolitionism was so controversial, even in the North, that people get really riled up about it. So some people are saying, like, wow, we have so much on our plate just trying to convince people slavery is wrong. If we start to say women have rights too, we're going to lose everyone. We're not going to convert anyone to the cause of anti-slavery. But then another group of people, particularly people following William Lord Garrison, said, hey, like, we're working for rights, and we're going to embrace all rights. We're going to take this all on. So if you ever teach about intersectionality or whatnot, this isn't a good thing to think about, that some people are saying, look, just one thing at a time. We can only deal with one issue at a time. Whereas other people are saying, no, all these rights are connected and we need to look at them all together. And one of the greatest intersectional reformers in the 19th century was Lucretia Mott. I'm going to skip over this. This is Angelina clapping back to Catherine Beecher. You can kind of look over that on your own. But Lucretia Mott was raised as a Quaker in a fairly wealthy family. She married another respectable, wealthy Quaker, and she was very deceptive looking. She was a tiny person, um, uh, not quite 5 feet tall, as I understand it, and for most of her life, under 90 pounds. But that respectable looking wife and mother and little person hid the mind of an extremely radical thinker. She was willing to challenge pretty much anything. And she was very committed to abolition and anti racism. She was part of a faction of Quaker called Hicksites that were not just pro abolition, they're also leery of the market economy, reducing everything to money. So again, they're part of that context of saying like we want our reform movements to embrace the spiritual, moral nature of peoples and not just reducing them to dollars. The Hicksites also believed that scripture was less important than the inner light. And Lucretia Mott, with other people, founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which became the longest running female anti-slavery society in the country. So Lucretia was not perfect, but she was one of the few abolitionist leaders who encouraged having an integrated anti-slavery society. It might be just completely incredulous to us today, but many anti-slavery societies were white only, which seems really weird to us in the present day. But Lucretia Mott's Philadelphia organization was integrated, and she seemed to listen to the Black women in her organization. And she was also working against racism. So some abolitionists were just focused on ending slavery and didn't think much about what was happening in their city or even in their own behavior and how they treated the free Black people in their towns. Whereas Lucretia Mott was well known for having huge dinner parties in her house, up to 50 people that were racially mixed, and inviting Black friends and neighbors over. And this was fairly scandalous for many people. William Lloyd Garrison, when he was in his early 20s, met her, and she taught him how to speak extemporaneously. He was a good writer, but people didn't think he was much of a speaker. And she encouraged him to stop using his notes and listen to his inner light and speak from the heart. And she also talked to him about a lot of the issues of the day. Garrison later wrote that the liberalization of his mind was due to James and Lucretia Mott. So she also she and her society used a lot of different methods to try and further reform cause of abolition. This included the free produce movement. So she and others boycotted anything produced by slaves, such as cotton and sugar, rice and indigo, and never quite caught on the way she dearly hoped it would. But she kept advocating for it, up to the Civil War. They also wrote petitions to Congress. They raised money, and they used it to support African American schools in their town. And she was also very well known as a traveling speaker. So in Quaker meetings, women could stand up and preach, and they could even get sort of little tickets or passes to go to another town and show it to the Quakers there and be accepted as a preacher. And so she was very well known, and people raved about what an effective speaker she was. So she was an intersectional person in the abolition movement who influenced a number of other people, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So in 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband and Lucretia Mott and James Mott went to a global anti-slavery convention in London, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott. I have an image here of Elizabeth Cady Stanton from probably 2 years later. She doesn't have kids when she goes to London, but I like this picture of her as a young woman to kind of get the sense of, who she is when she goes to London. And the convention there, the anti-slavery convention there, was very conservative. It would not recognize women on the floor of the convention, even women who were sent as delegates from their anti-slavery societies in America. And it also didn't recognize Hicksite Quakers. It considered them heretics. So Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton became friends and sort of bonded over their exclusion as women from this anti-slavery conference. And Lucretia Mott was a fair bit older than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And in her memoirs, Stanton kind of revealed she had this massive girl crush on Lucretia Mott. She wrote, "On the following Sunday, I went to hear Mrs. Mott preach in a Unitarian church. Though I had never heard a woman speak, yet I had long believed she had the right to do so, and had often expressed the idea in private circles. But when at last I saw a woman rise up in the pulpit and preach earnestly and impressively, as Mrs. Mott always did, it seemed to me the realization of an oft-repeated happy dream." I found in this new friend a woman emancipated from all faith in man made creeds, from all fear of his denunciations. Nothing was too sacred for her to question as to its rightfulness in principle and practice. So, this is just one example of the connections between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. That people like the Grimkey sisters and Lucretia Mott were standing and speaking on the subject of anti-slavery, and then shocking people with the practice of a woman doing that, and starting to create an ideology of rights, of women's rights, to support their ability to do that. And then people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton then take those ideas and that inspiration and keep developing them over time. So these aren't the only people, but I'm giving you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the connections in this world. And ultimately, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and a number of other people, including a few male allies, most notably Frederick Douglass, gathered together in upstate New York in Seneca Falls in 1888. And modeling on the Declaration of Independence, wrote the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, where they asserted the equality of women and their rights and liberties, and had a long list of grievances against men and things that men had done that they disagreed with. We'll look at this larger document in our breakout session. It's notable to point out that the Black abolitionists who were there and who moved in these circles, and Lucretia Mott, are the most intersectional people, that they were concerned with all kind of aspects of rights, and not just abolition, but anti-racism as well, and were supportive of women's rights. Whereas the white reformers tended to kind of go in on a single issue, that some of them would stay just on abolition and didn't want to be concerned with women's rights, whereas other ones, once they got into women's rights, they really embraced women's rights and did not want to spend too much time or energy thinking about abolition. And most heartbreaking, this kind of exploded in some really nasty business in the fights over the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, when a lot of women really wanted to prioritize their rights over Black rights, which was heartbreaking to people like Lucretia Mott and other people who were more intersectional. So if we return to the guiding question, we can see many ways that the abolition and women's rights movements were connected. One connection is the ideology of individual rights. From people, there's also people who are active in all the causes, like the Grimkeys, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass. There's also religious influences. On the image on the right, which came out of the abolitionist movement, it says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" The idea or the use of the terms brother and sister were very common in the Second Great Awakening. It's the idea of a religious brotherhood and sisterhood of all believers in Jesus. And so this kind of begs the religious convictions of someone who is not yet converted to anti-slavery and sees this, and they're supposed to recognize the suffering of another woman. You should consider her your sister. Like, you should come across the racial lines and open your heart to recognizing the sin of slavery and start to work for the anti-slavery cause. And that's just one visual representation of the religious images, influences in the abolition movement. And you could see how Sarah and Angelina Grimke clearly drew on religion to justify speaking in public and other aspects of women's rights. And Lucretia Mott's Quaker influence helped her think about her inner light and how it shines in all people, male, female, and of all races. And also, something connecting these movements are a massive backlash, that they were both incredibly radical movements at the time, and people in both movements faced a lot of criticism, both as individuals and of the larger project. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to move on to the next portion if it's questions or whatnot.